Welcome everyone, Questini here with my review of Total War Pharaoh, the latest game from Creative Assembly, specifically CA Sophia, the guys who have made all the Saga games. It had been my hope with Total War Pharaoh that with a bigger budget, with more time, with more focus, they could deliver a better project than what they did in either Fronts of Britannia or Troy Total War. In particular, I hoped that they would take the concepts, gameplay concepts, campaign concepts in particular, from Troy and improve them. They did not. In fact, I would dare say that this game is, in a significant number of ways, worse than Troy is. There are some exceptions. There are some things that this game does better than Troy, far better than Troy. See, one of the biggest problems in Troy is there was a significant amount of campaign imbalance between the starting positions of various factions. Like basically the Trojans were significantly more powerful than the Chians, in particular because of the way the map was designed. There was also a huge focus on naval combat in a game that didn't have naval battles, so that wasn't that great. However, although that's not the case and the starting positions are certainly far more balanced in this game than they were in Troy, every faction has a decent amount of potential, every faction has a decent amount of territory they can take without experiencing the same level of frustration that you did experience in the most genuine sense in Troy. The problem is, with this particular game, the fundamental issue is that you have a game where the legendary lords, the rulers, don't feel that unique to actually play, which is certainly not the case when we're thinking about Troy. See, in Troy, if you're playing a campaign as Achilles, who had his temper tantrums and his Myrmidons, it was a very different campaign to play than a campaign as Agamemnon or Menelaus. Like Agamemnon was the only one who could vassalize, Menelaus was the only one with global recruitment, and with a unique system of global recruitment in that he could global recruit from his allies as well, and he had structures to help with that. So you had a lot of uniqueness in the campaigns and the legendary lords of Troy, and that's just the baseline ones. Well, it certainly felt like they were stripping features like the vassalization and global recruitment system to make Agamemnon Menelaus unique. They did manage in that game of making every single campaign unique in one way or another. Like, consider Paris and Hector, who both had to deal with the supporter system or the precursor supporter system for Kislev, but it was significantly better wards, better system, better handling than what we got with Kislev. The AI still cheated, but it wasn't really too big of a downside there, at least once you got past the initial early stage. Like, Paris was focused on range units. Yes, he had some heavy infantry, or quite a bit of heavy infantry, but his primary focus in terms of army was on range units. And he was focused on preserving the coast of Troy against the Achaeans, because he was the one that started closest to him. But on the other hand, his campaign focus was on utilizing the significant power that Helen could give in his campaign, whereas Hector was focused on building a massive network of alliances for significant campaign benefits, while heading east to unite the lands against the Achaeans, and focusing more on heavy infantry. So significant differences between the campaigns. That's just the baseline campaigns. When you think of Rhesus, when you think of Memnon, when you think of Ajax, Diomedes, the Amazons, very significant differences. And each campaign felt very different than one another. That is not the case in Pharaoh. Like, every Egyptian campaign kind of feels the same. Yes, there are differences. There are differences in terms of unique units. There's differences in the titles each faction gets. There's differences in command. Like, Ramesses can have his armies attack in march stance. And there's some differences in court actions, but they certainly do not feel unique in as much of a significant way as they should. Even if they do start in very different positions and they do have a different starting dilemma to deal with, ultimately each campaign ends up feeling very similar, because if you're playing an Egyptian campaign, you're going to go for Pharaoh regardless of who you are. If you're playing a Hittite campaign, you're going to go for the Throne of Hatti, or you're going to start with the Throne of Hatti if you're Shupal Yuma, because you are the great king of Hatti. And if you're Canaanite, you might think, oh, the Canaanites get a lot of diversity in their campaigns. But not really. I mean, I want to compare Irsu to Achilles. Like, Achilles was, you could play Achilles, and it wasn't necessary to do so, but one of the things you could do with Achilles in Troy is you could play Achilles as the great raider, in the sense that, as a ravager, if you will, as Irsu is, because you could embrace a personality where Achilles would get a significant amount of income from post-battle loot and from sacking and looting settlements. Irsu gets a bit of a benefit, but like Ursu's campaign, the only difference between Ursu's campaign and everyone else is, as civilization degrades, if it does degrade, which is no guarantee, as civilization degrades, he can benefit from that degradation of civilization to improve his armies. He doesn't suffer from it. That's what I'm basically saying over here. But you still need to take and hold territory. Then, like, compared to the specific faction mechanics of each ruler in Troy, the heroes as they were called, compared to the uniqueness that they had in each campaign, you can think of Aeneas with his ability to speak to those departed. You can think of Ajax. You can think, again, of Achilles. You can think of Sarpedon in his influence system. You can think of the Amazons. That kind of uniqueness is severely lacking there. It's severely lacking here. Yes, there are unique structures. There are unique units. But it's just not that great of a system. Like, it feels like what they did in Pharaoh is they looked at a campaign in Troy and they said, let's tone it down. And they did, in every way that matters. Their economy is slower. Armies are inherently smaller. Like, someone put it best when they started talking about Troy, a fellow YouTuber, when they got access to Pharaoh, they put it best in that we're paying about the same upkeep and recruitment cost as we did in Troy, but the problem is our economy is far smaller, which it is. Now, one of the great things about Pharaoh is that you can avoid some of these issues, or all of these, or you can avoid the issue of playing a limited campaign by giving yourself a lot of money, lowering upkeep, increasing replenishment, increasing our diplomatic ability. But while doing these things is great and will help your campaign, ultimately, it's really going to reflect how limited the campaign is, because you end up in a situation, if you use these kind of options, you're just going to end up dominating the map. And hell, you end up dominating the map even if you're playing on default settings. It's just a bit slower. So it's not really that big of an issue. What about the sea peoples? Aren't they a big problem? Well, they are, and they aren't. They start showing up after the first 30 turns. So what that really means is you need to accomplish a significant amount in those first 30 turns, because you're going to start being slowed down by them after those first 30 turns. And they're going to show up here near Cyprus, basically on the sea, like from Cyprus, like everything west of Cyprus in this particular area, this is where they're going to show up. And there's also going to be desert nomads, the Libyans, showing up basically all in the entire western part of the desert. You can disable this because it's really more of an annoyance than a major feature. And the hilarious part is it takes 100 turns for the main force to arrive. Now, I think you have to be a pretty bad player to not be in such a dominant position in the campaign to dominate the map. Like, now granted, maybe you don't know what you're doing, you're trying to figure it out, but I don't think even on your first playthrough, unless you really screwed it up, and you can, don't get me wrong, you can screw up, you can overextend, you might make mistakes. It might just be when you're learning that you actually struggle against the sea people. Otherwise, they're just a genuine nuisance, and they're supposed to be this main feature. And it really doesn't feel like that, to be honest, in a campaign when you are playing this game. So, lack of uniqueness with the Ledgering Lords. Sea peoples are a disappointment. I have to say, like, when I look, I have to say it does feel better than the in-game Crisis of Warhammer 3, because it isn't just like, oh, a massive wave of people showing up. No, they will show up constantly for the campaign, but they don't amount to much. Like, initially it's armies of 11 units, then 13 units, 19 units, 16 units, 19 units, and higher tiers as you progress the campaign. But there's free experience and money. That's really what the sea people amount to. And all they manage to do, if even that, is potentially slow down your campaign progress in other ways, because you do need to take a significant amount of territory through, during the course of the campaign. Units. Now, with all of that being said, let me talk about the campaign mechanics in an actual campaign. This is a customized campaign, turn 59 as Shupaluma. I have won this campaign long ago. I'm just a couple of points from the ultimate victory, and I could really achieve that very quickly if I wanted to. Now, in theory, this works the same way as a Trojan campaign does, with the exception that, of course, it's a historical mode for Troy. Now, from my perspective, that is far less interesting than mythology. I get it. They're trying to appeal to the historical crowd, but I'll be honest, as someone who's a big, passionate fan of history, making a game like this about the Bronze Age and the way they did is not a really interesting situation. It's actually quite the opposite. It is very janky and boring. And to be honest, we know so very little about the Bronze Age, and you end up with a limited campaign because of that. Now, here's the thing. Here's the crucial difference between this game and Troy. And yes, I'm going to compare it to Troy because this game is, in many ways, far more limited to Troy. The amount of income you're getting from buildings, from economic structures, is far lower in this game than it did in Troy. You're not... While I have a significant cache of resources over here, I want to point out this is turn 59. I've been dominating the campaign map. I control a fairly significant amount of territory over here, like half the map more or less is either under my direct control or vassals over here. Now, what is the difference? While you are gaining less resources, wood and stone are primarily used for structures, whereas bronze and food is used for units. Gold is used for some structures and some units, but not really that much. Gold is mainly really you trade gold away for to other factions, or you recruit certain unique units in a campaign. There are some nice mechanics that they do have, like with vassals giving you gifts, like of other resources or vassal units in a campaign. The vassals are also annoying as well, because they'll break alliances with you when a faction declares war on you. You know what those sea peoples are going to do? And Kaskian raiders, because you also get those. Like if you're playing Hati, it's only an issue if you're playing Hati. Like the Egyptians get to deal with desert nomads, you get to deal with Kaskians and Phrygians, who are going to show up in your lands like either in the west or in the north of Hati. The annoying thing is when a faction like this spawns, it's going to be a new faction that will declare war on you, and it's going to take time declaring war on you and all your vassals in turn. But the thing is, you might lose a vassal agreement when that happens, which is annoying because then you have to either beat them up to get them in line, or you can use campaign customization to have a benefit to diplomacy to get them in line through that. But it's just a frustrating system in that respect.
Hold your tongue.
Now, what I do like is like resources like stone and wood that are used for buildings are largely just used for buildings. Wood is useful, of course, for chariots, of course, but for the most part, wood and stone in particular, is used for buildings. Now, this creates an interesting campaign dynamic where you may want to sack a lot of the settlements you take, because while it is going to take stone and wood to rebuild them, you're not going to lose workforce, which I'll get into in just a moment. You're not going to lose workforce for that, because if you sack a settlement and take it over, you're going to gain the workforce. So if you're sacking a tier 2 settlement, then there's no reason never to sack a tier 2 settlement, unless like there's some special structure like a landmark in it, because it will give you bronze. Bronze is the main bottleneck. Cyprus is the only province that has a significant amount of bronze, and guess what? All those sea peoples are spawning near Cyprus. So enjoy dealing with that, trying to hold it Cyprus. It does create a good, interesting campaign dynamic. Like if you want a lot of bronze, you will have to hold vulnerable territory. What I dislike about the way they handle the economy, even with campaign customization, it's far more limited. They're trying to artificially slow down the player's progress. That's essentially it. And they do it in multiple ways as well. They do it by affecting your replenishment if civilization starts collapsing, and buffing the sea peoples, because they're rogue armies led by rank 1 generals. So they're not worth a damn unless civilization collapses. So they're trying to artificially slow down a campaign, limiting your economy, limiting what you can achieve, limiting your replenishment. But this just pushes you as a player to the most optimal way to play the game as a result of this is to just basically push as hard as you can early on until these guys arrive. And once they do arrive, funnily enough, they're actually an advantage to you because other factions, because you're at war with the same type of factions, you'll end up at war with the same type of factions. You can make alliances with other factions easier. You might get vassal agreements easier. So you might end up dominating the map and gaining those pillars of civilization. So there's some good things that I do appreciate. In Troy, it certainly felt like gold and wood were like dominant resources that eclipse everything else. Things are more balanced in this game. Bronze is the wood and gold, but even bronze is not quite on the same ridiculous level. The reason gold and wood were so important is like wood was used for every structure and it required a significant amount of wood to build anything. You do need resources in this game, sure, but you don't need an absolute insane level of resources. And if you do, you will get the resources. Like wood, you don't need a whole lot of wood for structures. Like even as the Hittites who have an abundance of wood, you don't need so much wood. So that is good. I just like how much units cost to recruit, but in terms of handling settlements, that's certainly great. They did limit the economy to artificially slow it down, but they did make it more balanced between the different resources. With the exception of bronze, but even then that's in a better state. Another thing I like about the campaign map is that they added all of these outposts. Now people will complain, oh, it's all about modifiers and all that. But here's the thing. They added this outpost system, and it's not just a gimmick of a system. Now, well, except forts. Forts are a gimmick that you should get rid of as quickly as possible because you can station 10 units, but it's just not worth it from my perspective. But instead, you can get things like attrition immunity for... Well, this is actually a temple. Or shrine. So you get various structures that give you different benefits. Like if you pray to a god, you get various benefits. Like, for instance, I pray to Corinta. It gives me 30% movement range, attrition immunity, and all that. Attrition immunity is important in navigating the desert. I think outposts really add quite a bit to a province because it does give you the option of specializing in a province. Sure, you want to gain legitimacy, you want to get production benefits, you want to get shrines to give prayers. But the interesting thing about these shrines is when you move an army to any outpost, you will replenish some of the movement that is required. Like 50% of the movement that you spent to get there will be replenished in that army that you just sent. That's certainly a nice system because you can hop from outpost to outpost to outpost, and it really is like how you build your settlements, which outposts you build, where you build them. You do have specific locations where they're built, but how you decide to build up a province is important. So whatever may be said about CA Sophia, they did handle this well. And I have to say, like, what I like about the outpost system, it certainly makes provinces feel more alive than they were before. Because it's not like, you look at a desert province, you know that all of these things are interactable. You can raise them, you can sack them for resources, stone and bronze, if you are at war with a faction, or you can build them up. They cost stone to build up, for the most part. Now, I feel the AI is making the wrong decision most of the time because the AI loves to build forts and station units in them just to annoy the crap out of you as a player. But I appreciate the system because while it's not the same kind of building system that we have in Rome 1 and Medieval 2, which I consider the best building system, the best element system in the entire series, it is a way within the current settlement system that we do have to make things better. Another thing I also appreciate greatly about the game, even though let me be clear on this, and I'm not sugarcoating it, I think this game is going to do really poorly. I think it has a lot of issues, like the lack of variety in Legendary Lords and all that. But another thing I greatly appreciate is how they've decided to handle building slots and building up settlements. So here's how things work. You still have the growth system from You still have the growth system from Total War, or from Rome, really. But you still have the growth system. You still have happiness. You have influence as well, which Troy also did have. But now you get the workforce growth. Now, these are the surplus points you have in Warhammer 3, for instance. Now, what's good about this? One, they removed the public order penalty, the happiness penalty that you have had since Rome 2. Thank you. It took CA many years to do it, but they have finally removed that god-awful difficulty bullshit. Unfortunately, you can't really customize legendary, or you can't customize battle difficulty, because I would really like to remove the morale that the AI gets on very hard. You can't customize some of those things in terms of like what legendary gives to the AI, what they get in terms of battle. But I do appreciate the fact that at least they removed the public order penalty. And yes, this is a customized campaign, but it's not there by default. If you play the default experience, you will not have to deal with a legendary public order penalty. Just annoys the hell out of you. So instead, here's how it works. High happiness gives you more workforce and gives you more morale benefit on recruitment of units. Whereas low happiness affects your workforce growth, so your growth, lowers morale on recruitment, and also increases construction time. So you do care about having high happiness. It's not an irrelevant thing. You want to get that workforce growth. Influence increases the production of resources, whereas if you have low influence, you're reducing the production of resources by quite a bit. So having a high level of influence, building it up, is important. Whereas a workforce growth, if it's low, it increases happiness by a bit, by up to 2 if it's just very low. But as it gets higher, it reduces your happiness. But at the same time, it increases your recruitment slots. This is a much better system than in any other Total War game. Say what you will about CA Sophia, they're not stupid. Like, there are things they handle really poorly from my perspective, absolutely. And I do feel that they artificially made the game. They were trying to make campaigns artificially long for whatever reason. But this system alone, what you're seeing here on the left side, is vastly superior to anything any other Total War game has had in years, well over half a decade. Combine that with the outpost system. Then we get the way the settlements work. So here's an interesting thing. You got administration, you got management, military support, recruitment, production, resources, and religion. While the resource buildings are far more limited in Troy, and religion just basically goes to temple or unique temples that you may only build in, specific settlements, like the Grand Temple over here that gives certain benefits. Here's how it works. Every structure requires surplus points. Tier 1, 1, Tier 2, 2, Tier 3, Tier 4, 4, Tier 3, 3, Tier 5, 5. Now, you are not limited necessarily by tiers. You might be in certain cases in terms of like the tier of the main structure, but you may not necessarily be so. Instead, what's the limiting factor is the workforce. Building up the main structure gives you construction slots, improves your resource capability, influence, for instance, in this case, playing as Shupaliuma, workforce growth, influence, more workforce growth in the province. So it's a bit weird. I guess, it's workforce growth from each developed construction slot in the region. So the main structure helps you get more workforce, and influence and happiness. The other structures, resources, unit production, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of modifiers you can get. So you can get the structure that gives you happiness, replenishment, and workforce growth. There's one that gives you just happiness and influence. Another one that focuses on influence. Another one that focuses on movement on land, construction cost, construction time. And then you get in the unique structures. You have resource modifiers, so you can get, apprentice goldsmith into royal goldsmith for extra gold. And then, you have the resource building, the military production buildings, things like officer training ground. Hey, you want to recruit generals at a higher rank? Well, you can get the structure that gives you +6 recruitment rank on your generals, and that's before counting for the fact that there is also research that increases recruitment rank of generals by +2. So you can recruit higher level characters. You can specialize provinces. I still feel garrison buildings are not really worth it. It's kind of one of those weird things, like where CA thinks we're going to bother with garrison buildings. Don't. It's a waste of resources because you're consuming slots for garrison buildings. What you really want to do in a campaign is what I've done here. You want, if absolutely necessary to have a defensive force, have a mobile defensive force. A stationary army, a stationary garrison does very little. Mobility and aggression wins the day. Not garrison, not a defensive playstyle. Don't tell that to CA because they have their head in the sand when it comes to this. CA genuinely thinks that we're gonna spend waste turns of our lives besieging settlements. You should never do that. You put in the minimal effort to besiege any particular settlement. Like over here, if I'm gonna go for Memphis, I'm gonna go for Memphis with overwhelming force and crush it in the fastest time possible. I am not going to waste my time besieging it for multiple settlements. But that's the intent, like, obviously, of the garrison buildings is to make sieges harder. But there's no way to make them hard. If a settlement is too hard to take, the worst decision you can make as a player is to waste turns besieging a settlement. So that is a campaign design philosophy that is just not good, but they still have it. And they need to account for this. I'm not against the idea of requiring players to devote significant resources to take a settlement, but we're in a campaign map, right? There's never a situation where devoting those resources is ever worth it in a campaign, because if you're in a position where you can't take it, then go take something else. Because resources, experience, replenishment, and then bring your armies together if there's a target that's too difficult to take down. That's the much better plan than wasting your time laying siege to a settlement. So garrison buildings are worthless. But I do greatly appreciate the mechanics in play in terms of building settlements, because you have a lot more flexibility. It is a lot more of an interesting system to constantly have a workforce growth, having to spend resources, building up your settlements, having choices or that. Like, look at this. This is a tier 2 settlement, and you can see how many building slots I already have uncovered. This is great because it gives you more flexibility, as opposed to what happens in Warhammer 3, where getting a settlement to the highest possible level is the most important thing. It's still important to get to a high level, but you have other choices, and you have a lot more flexibility in your campaign because of that. Now, diplomacy is not really necessarily that different from, say, playing Agamemnon and Troy. It's a good system. You don't have the allegiance point system, so you can't. You don't have the same kind of control, if you will, over vassals. You can't take control of one of their armies. I kind of wish you could, but you do get gifts from vassals in the campaign. Other things that you have. You do have the deities. Now, you can worship up to 3 deities, or you can go with the 10. Now, a 10 is a special god. It requires picking an ancient legacy, which I'll talk in just a moment. But for the most part, when it comes to deities, what you do is you start with God. Everyone starts with their own god, right? As Shupoliuma, I start with Arena. You get benefits from shrines, like in this case, happiness and food, recruitment costs. You get prayers, which any of your generals can get access to. So in this case, rent income, resources from looting and occupying, plus 20% resources from sacking. And then you get 1 devoted general per god. If you worship a 10, you can only worship a 10. And you can devote 2 generals. So each other god has 1 devoted general. So over here, I'm worshiping Arena, Kurunta, and Taruna as gods. And there's different benefits. Some gods are better than others, I think. Like having a god that gives you attrition, desert attrition is pretty much mandatory in a campaign. So Kurunta, for instance, is very, very important to get access to in a campaign. Or Isis, if you're talking about the Egyptians. Like you can either have all the gods available from the start with the campaign customization option, or you can discover them as you play the campaign. I'm not sure why they decide to limit that. It just feels, again, like one of those things. They artificially limited things to make to slow the pace of the game down, which I don't really understand. I feel like that was a mistake, but maybe they were trying to avoid the situation in Troy where everyone went to Aphrodite because that was the best god you could go for early on in campaign, and everything else was secondary. There was never really any reason to go anything other than Aphrodite, Zeus, and Poseidon maybe for the Cyclops, but really Aphrodite and Zeus were really powerful. Zeus for the Minotaur, Aphrodite for happiness and growth. they were maybe trying to avoid that and force you to play with a wider variety of gods, which they did succeed at. You do have a greater variety of gods that you use in a campaign. They are more meaningful, but I'm not quite sure about the limitations. Now, research-wise, there's the research tree is not really that great, but you can at least improve the research rate, so you can experiment more in a campaign with things here. If you're playing a Canaanite, there is a research in this particular location that gives you a significant benefit in terms of legitimacy, so you always want to get that. Outside of that, you're not really forced down any particular path. Well, as Egyptians, there is an archer benefit down here, but yeah, like otherwise, you have choices that you can make. Nothing feels particularly overpowered research-wise, except like just, you know, 2 things in the entirety of the research trees in the campaign. They all feel very similar to each other, which is the problem overall in the game. Like, each campaign kind of ends up playing similar. Like, I'm Shupaluma, and I'm in the middle of Egypt, marching on their capital. Yeah, that's a bit screwed. Then you have the power of the crown. So the way this system works is, if you go for the throne of Hati, and you can do so if you have territory in the Sacred Land. Like, Shupaluma obviously starts as the Great King of Hati, so he doesn't get the choice to go for anything else. Others may have it if they get Sacred Land in the other territory. So when I say Sacred Land, let me just show what I'm talking about. So these are sacred Egyptian lands. Some of them are not available over here, and these are Hittite sacred lands. They give something called legitimacy. The more legitimacy you have, the more you can contend to the throne. You need to get... Potential pretenders need to claim like 3/4 of the legitimacy of either the Pharaoh or the Great King of Hati in order to contest the crown. If you're playing Shupaluma, you can prevent the civil war from happening in Hati. The only one who can really contest it is Kurunta anyway. Now, being king, Pharaoh, king, Great King, gives you the ability of vassalizing other factions. You can't do it otherwise. Only the king can do it. Or a pretender to the throne while a civil war is going on. Now, while a civil war is going on, you may declare war against other factions. But here's the thing. Once the civil war ends, those wars within that faction, within that race, if you will, within the Egyptians or the Hittites, will end. And you'll have a diplomatic penalty if you declare war immediately after. So you got to plan this out. Generally speaking, there will be civil wars in both Hati and Egypt fairly early on in the campaign, considering this is on Legendary. These things will happen. Especially as the Pharaoh of Egypt will die relatively quickly in the campaign, about 20 turns in. Now, what the crowns give you... Well, Egyptians get fancy hats as items, whereas the Hittites get a selection of weapons, an axe, a spear, a bow, if you've got Kurunta as capital... or a spear if you've got Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite kingdom. Then you have powers, things like being able to fill out 2 out of 5 positions in the court, or improving resource production. The powers do depend on the faction you're picking, like either Egypt or Hati. But there are some things that are shared, like competency and annexation. So you can force annex a faction that has up to 3 regions. That's not really as great as you might think. Because while, to be sure, I can, I could potentially annex certain factions. Maybe Parha, or over here, because they only have 2 regions. I'm not sure why I'm not able to. But while you might be able to forcefully confederate some factions, it just feels a bit limiting with our 3 regions. Talking about like the slower pace of the campaign that they're clearly aiming for. Oh yeah, I see, yeah, because they have all of this territory. Like they've got too much territory for me to be able to forcibly vassalize them. Maybe if they lose something. Then you've got the court system, which has a different number of positions that give you different benefits. Like over here, I have the High Judge position, and I have the Great King position. And what else do I have? Oh yeah, I also have High Commander. Like High Command, there are different benefits. Like Great King, you can get units in special recruitment, and intrigues cost additional gold or regard. plots against you have lower chance of success, and you get legitimacy as well. High Judge gives you the ability of doing a ruling for various faction benefits and resources, and also if you visit Sacred Lands, you can modify happiness. Lawgiver can visit Sacred Land for resources. Sacred Lands for resources, and there's also various actions you can take in the court. Generally speaking, there's some kind of benefits, like you can set army wages to reduce recruitment costs, you can lower construction costs, you can get various benefits, or buff the bodyguards of a general, because the way generals work in this game, they're not single entities. They do have a fair amount of survivability, but the way generals work is they command an elite unit, which depends on like the kind of items that you have. Like over here, I have a bludgeon, so they're basically club infantry. Club infantry being heavy armor piercing. Axes are split between. Swords are just pure base damage for the most part, with a bit of armor piercing. Everyone has a bit of armor piercing, but yeah, clubs have the most amount of armor piercing. And then finally, we have the ancient legacies. There's 2 for Hatti, several for Egypt. The best one for the Hittites is the Benevolent, because you get free instant construction. Like, the way it works is, the more your people are happy, the more your vassals are happy with you, the more gratitude you get per turn. Now, you can leave this passive, because you will get more resources from your vassals, or you can use these tokens, you can spend this gratitude to get tokens, and get free instant construction, ancillaries, embed informants, which you can use to spy on factions in the diplomacy screen, court actions, and extra experience for your army. So this is really powerful. For Egypt, there are things like caravans, which you can use. You can go with a 10 to basically combine 2 gods in 1 and get 2 generals focused on a god. A 10 is incredibly powerful. Significant amount of power with that. You can also build special monuments in a campaign for various benefits, or focus on taking these pillars of civilization more easily. I think some of them are just not worth it. Now, let's talk a bit about civilization. So the way civilization works is you have pillars of civilization. The higher civilization is, the better off you'll be in any campaign, including Ursu, who can benefit from low civilization, but there are benefits from high civilization. There's various events that can happen, disasters, earthquakes, floods, and all that. But the chances increase the lower the civilization is. Also, you can get a blessing if you have a high level of civilization. The lower civilization is, the stronger sea people and desert nomads get. So you want to generally keep civilization up. It will make your campaign easier. Now, how does this work? Well, there are these settlements, these specific settlements, like Menefer, a 10 city. Like, this is a city that only a 10 can get, a 2 sound and all that. Basically, the way this works, and I'll just go to diplomacy to disable that. The way this works is, at tier 3, you get 10 civilization points in each of these settlements. These settlements will all start tier 3, I think. Like, with the exception of a 10 special city, they all start tier 3. They can go up to tier 5. So they'll start at 10 civilization points. They'll go to 50 each. And there's a couple of other things that can improve civilization, but for the most part, it's the main settlement buildings in these particular settlements. If it goes down, civilization goes down, sea people and desert nomads get stronger. So you want to take these settlements, or ensure a faction has them that's going to take care of them. So for instance, over here I gave Gubla to Bey, who is my vassal. He's going to take care of it. He's already got it tier 5. It's got 50 civilization points there. It is certainly a way of handling this. Of course, you can always abuse it. Like, if you really want to crush civilization, just destroy some of these settlements. It will come crashing down in short order. Looking at you, Ursu. But if you want to build up civilization, it's not really that hard of an issue, hard of a thing to build up civilization. Just take these settlements, get them to tier 3 tier 5 as quickly as possible. You can maintain maintain prosperity of civilization fairly easily in a campaign. Or even if it initially goes down, I think you would really need to majorly screw up to have low level of civilization, or do it deliberately to have low level of civilization by the time the sea peoples arrive. It will start going down as factions war with each other and the settlement levels are going to go down as they change hands. But eventually, eventually civilization is going to start flourishing again. So much for the Bronze Age collapse, really. Like, the combination of events, at least on Legendary, required to really bring about a complete state of collapse is... It requires a lot. Like, it requires constant wars, constant disasters. Like, disasters can also lower civilization levels because they damage the settlement. Ursu can also lower them for a temporary period by 20 through his command. That's how that system works. Now, overall, here's how I feel about this. While certainly the campaign map isn't that great, it does avoid the sea issue that Troy had. It did avoid the imbalance of the bad campaign starts of Troy, but it's certainly a limited campaign.
Hungry for war.
On the other hand, I do quite like what they did in terms of the systems. I just wish they hadn't limited the economy by as much as they did. That would have been a much better system than what we ended up getting over here. But overall, I do like if it was just the question of campaign mechanics, while there are certainly issues in terms of deliberately slowing the pace of the campaign, other problems, I do think it does have some of the best campaign mechanics of any campaign that's been released in a Total War game for a very, very long time right now. At least when we're considering the post-Rome 2 campaign mechanics. Lack of uniqueness, limited campaign, deliberately dragging it down, those are the problems. So you might think, well, Pharaoh is certainly a decent enough game, right? In terms of performance, the campaign map runs fairly well, for the most part. I would say the campaign map runs fairly well. There's some options that are missing that were added, like TXAA, I believe, like Warhammer 3 does have that. I haven't looked at my Warhammer 3 settings for a very, very long time when it comes to that. But there are some things that are lacking. But overall, it runs pretty solid. The end turn timer is pretty good. It's only really the rogue armies of the Sea Peoples that slow it down, and that's annoying in itself. Like, Sea Peoples are just an annoyance, really. You might enjoy the campaign more without them, but then again, there wouldn't be much into a campaign without them past like turn 60 in any campaign, vanilla campaign or customized campaign, it doesn't matter. So it does suffer from having limited campaigns. But if I was judging this game just based on the campaign experience, yeah, I would say it's pretty solid. Would it be worth the price? No. CA is being greedy, and they're overcharging like hell for this. It doesn't have some of the charm that Troy did have, and you are playing a limited campaign where, sure, you can customize it to make it better, but you don't have the same kind of uniqueness that Troy did have. So I don't think it's worth paying as much when Troy was available for free. Just gonna be clear. And I think even picking up Troy right now, in some ways, in certain campaigns, the Trojan campaigns, can be a better and more exciting experience than this. It does have better campaign mechanics. I like the growth system. I like the workforce system. I like the changes they made to happiness, influence, and all that. But honestly, some things feel like gimmicks. Like Ancient Legacies don't feel that great. But if it was just campaign mechanics, it would be pretty solid enough. But it's not just campaign mechanics, is it? No. It's battles as well. Now, the biggest problem in Pharaoh comes down to the battles, be it open field battles, minor settlement battles, or major settlement battles, sieges, if you will. When it comes to open field battles, they're in the best spot out of all of them, but here's the problem. CA Sophia was trying to say, oh, things are going to be interesting because lighter units have more mobility on the battlefield. They do. And, archers are good against lightly armored units, but not so great against heavily armored units. All of that stuff. None of that really matters, because ultimately, the person who has the heaviest infantry, for the most part, tends to win. The only interesting aspect of battles is the fact, like, if you're playing Ursu, he gets a bunch of units that you can't control, kind of like the Lizardmen, where it's like you lose control of your entire army and you can't control it. It's an experience playing with Ursu's army. But with the exception of, like, that kind of unique experience, which only applies to Ursu's army, generally speaking, heavier infantry units will dominate against lightly armored units. The problem isn't that the principles they're trying to go for, where, lighter units have more mobility on the battlefields, heavier units, they can last better, but of course armor can be degraded with enough damage, so heavily armored units which are slower to move may have some issues in that. The problem isn't with the principles, the problem is how they decide to go about it. One, there's significant performance issues in battles, especially if the reinforcements are on. Like, anytime reinforcements show up, there's a significant reduction in terms of performance, and this is on a fairly good computer. Like, I don't have issues playing battles in Warhammer 3 in the same way that I have issues playing battles in Pharaoh. And it's a bit bizarre because I never had these issues in Troy. Certainly not to the same extent. I mean, Troy's performance was not the best in the series, but it was certainly better in terms of battle performance. But the problem is, even in Troy, you had this situation where heavily armored units tended to dominate against lightly armored units. Because it doesn't matter what kind of mobility you have on the battlefield, if a heavy unit can just shrug off your charge, like, it doesn't matter. And that was certainly a problem in Troy. It remains a problem in Pharaoh. So a Hittite army is just the flat best army in the game. Yes, the Egyptians and Canaanites do have some counters, but it's just them trying to compete in that heavy armor unit type situation, in particular with axemen, who have a balance between regular damage and armor piercing damage, or clubmen who have pure armor piercing damage. Things are more interesting in Egypt. Like, if it was just Egypt, things would be a lot more interesting, because in Egypt, light units can actually hold their own because everyone else is lacking in terms of heavy armored units. So even though you can get some medium armored units, light units can compete with that. They just can't compete against the tide of death and destruction that the Hittites have, or even the Sea Peoples have, which is another issue. So while lightly armored units may do well in desert conditions, it doesn't matter anyway. Like, you form a choke, like a heavily armored army in a choke point or corner camping, or in such a position on the map where they can take advantage of their heavy armor, is just going to dominate against a lightly armored army. So basically, this forces you as a player, you don't experiment, you don't play with different unit types. You might, if you're, with the major exception of Amon Mes, whose strong archers dominate his neighbors, but with that exception, and given the fact he's generally going to be dealing with a lot of lightly armored infantry early on, or even if it's heavy infantry, it lacks, they're going to be spearmen, or they're lacking the capability of dealing with units in melee. They have the survivability, but they don't have damage. You're going to have serious balance issues, which do exist. Like, trying to improve battles in this way, like, unit variety, map variety, it doesn't matter. It doesn't work. Like, even in the open field battles. What about chariots? The iconic unit of the Bronze Age warfare, right? From the Iliad to historical accounts of the Battle of Kadesh. What about chariots? Are chariots worth it? No. The problem with chariots is, one, it's a pathfinding issue that all units do share, but it affects chariots the most, because chariots are a unit that will take a lot of damage if you keep them in prolonged melee. But the problem is, when you charge with the chariot unit, they tend to get stuck in a really horrible fashion. I think the problem is, there are too many models per chariot unit. Like, if we had chariots similar to how they work in Warhammer 3, where there's 4 models or something along those lines, that would work far better, because it would be easier to control them, especially with this poor pathfinding, because there are pathfinding issues when we're looking at the battles of Pharaoh. If there were 4 models per unit, chariots would be far more useful. But as it stands, there is no reason whatsoever to recruit chariots. Archers do work to a limited extent. Archers stop working once they encounter heavily armored units that can do a lot of damage. In that case, you're just better off trying to compete in a similar way. This kills the unique faction unit variety that you do have, because it basically means Shupolium, Kurunta, and Ursu are good. Everyone else is far behind them. There is a problem right there. That is one of the big issues. So Seti is kind of okay, but the others, they're just far behind those legendary lords, those faction rulers that I just mentioned. So you have a significant imbalance being created by that. In theory, yes, light units can run in circles against heavily armored units, but if heavily armored units can just take the hits and you still need to kill enemy units to win, then it doesn't matter. It's not like the AI is going to take advantage of lightly armored units anyway, and you trying to take advantage of it, well, you still need a formidable front line to take the damage. And yeah, a couple of light units can help you out flanking, but yeah, limitations. The problem, though, is it gets worse when you account for the fact the vast majority of battles, regardless of which campaign settings you're using, regardless of campaign customization, the vast majority of battles are going to take place in settlements, or they're going to take place in walled cities. Here's the issue. It gets worse there. Because when you're trying to take the choke points of any settlement in the game, you have two options. One, you can use mass range units to weaken an enemy or draw them out. Because AI will sally out if you have far more range units and melee units and you're just trying to kill them. If that's the balance of your army, they will try and sally out to attack you. But then that's great. You can just send the handful of melee units you do have to kill the cluster of enemy units by shooting them from all sides. So it ends up being an upside, really. Also, range units are surprisingly much better in melee than you might think. So once they run out of ammo, they can actually hold their own decently well. Well, they won't hold against Hittite axemen, but they will hold against comparative units on the same tier of the same faction. Like Egyptian archers will hold their ground decently well against melee units. Chariots are supposed to are supposed to counter that, but chariots are useless. And the problem is you end up in this situation where we're fighting over choke points. The issue here is, if we look at history of warfare, the vast majority of battles throughout the history of warfare came down to morale. In a settlement battle in particular, especially since the AI loves building forts, so the AI is going to have 3 generals. If there's a regular army, they're going to have 1 general leading the army, then there's going to be the garrison leader, then there's going to be the outpost leader, the fort leader coming in. So 3 generals, which I think are giving them a significant morale bonus. So unless you're capable of killing all of them, it's kind of hard to kill generals in this game. I do appreciate that, because I was concerned about, it would be easy to kill generals. No, it's not easy to kill generals. I do appreciate that aspect, I might add. Because, general sniping, it was not a great thing in Rome 1 or Medieval 2 or many other Total War games. So while I do appreciate that situation, I do not appreciate having 3 morale boosters in a settlement where the AI fights like fanatical zealots that are going to fight to death, because it just feels like you basically have to kill the entire enemy army or a very substantial portion of it. It doesn't matter if you're completely encircling the enemy or you're fighting them tooth and nail on the front line. It has very little impact. It just comes down to a situation where morale shocks, flanking capabilities, killing their generals just doesn't feel that impactful. And it's worse when you're dealing with a settlement battle or a siege. As for sieges, they're awful. CA has this idea that we're supposed to besiege a settlement for many turns, build a significant amount of equipment. Is worthless, meaningless, pointless to do so. In fact, it's quite damaging in your campaign if you're wasting more than 1 turn besieging a settlement. If you cannot take a settlement in 1 turn with a single battering ram, you shouldn't attack the settlement, unless you have no other choice, unless, let's say, it's the last settlement the faction has, or it's a very crucial settlement. But even then, there's better options, like post a general with just 1 unit in an army as a lure, put your army in ambush stance, lure the defending army outside, wipe them out. That's basically the best strategy. So we're down to using ambush stance again to abuse AI behavior. Great, CA, because sieges are so awful as both the attacker and defender. No, as the defender, you can annihilate entire stacks of troops, but it's not a fun experience to deal with because it just takes so long to rout the enemy army. It is not a great and fun experience. Sieges have been a problem really in every Total War, even Rome 1 and Medieval 2, yes. They have always been a problem. They've never been done well. I would say Medieval 2, in terms of, European castles, Medieval 2 was far better because, towers like Legend of Total War made this point recently. Towers could shoot in multiple directions, so you could shoot units on the walls. So holding the walls was valuable. But even then, bring artillery breaking down the walls. And, and oil, but breaking down walls was still beneficial. Of course, oil, was acting as a benefit, benefit to the defender. Here you have a situation where if you cannot smash through the gates and win for the choke point of the gates, it's just not worth attacking a settlement. Or auto-resolving your way to victory. Yay, that is great. I do appreciate the fact that settlements don't have an auto-resolve benefit. Rather, the amount of siege equipment you build improves your auto-resolve chances. So the more equipment you build, the less casualties you'll take. It might take a couple of turns to get a good auto-resolve result, because fighting these sieges is just that painful of experience. I guess CA managed to succeed in making us besiege a settlement for more than one turn in the most awful way imaginable. It's still not a great situation. My point is, the battles in this game are some of the worst battles in a Total War game. Yes, even worse than Troy, because while Troy had the same kind of dynamic and it hasn't really been improved compared to Pharaoh, or hasn't really been improved in Pharaoh, Troy did have the myth units with Mythos. Like, this is just kind of like a worse version of the historical mode of Troy, which wasn't that great to begin with. People scream historical accuracy. These battles are not historically accurate, and I'm going to tell you, there are many ways of making a game like this, making a historically accurate game interesting. I can look at Ultimate General, right? In Ultimate General, just to give an example, in Ultimate General, when 2 units, since every unit has range, right? Cavalry, artillery, line infantry, because it's a Civil War game. When 2 units clash in melee, it's not a long clash. It may last a couple of seconds, but in those couple of seconds, each side takes significant casualties, and it boils down to who breaks first. A couple of clashes like this, or arrangement of range units to, like, range units do sustained damage, going in melee does burst damage. That's a much better way, and would, by the way, be more historically accurate, because one of the theory historians have about how melee battles were fought is like they were fought in bursts. They weren't fought like one side fighting each other for hours and hours and hours without end in neither side. Melee combat, like fighting someone in melee, is exhausting. Extremely so. So they would have either rotated units. One of the things Romans were known for was rotating units who were fighting, like they would rotate the soldiers that were on the front line, like move them back, let the guys rest, sending more guys. That was one of the things the Romans were known for. So it's not like we don't have historical records to kind of prove that this is how people fought. We do. It's just like Creative Assembly and Total War have always had this nonsense idea that people would just fight to the death and prolong melee. That's not how these battles would be fought. There are other games that do it better. There are other Total War games that do it better. This ridiculous idea of long engagements where even if you completely outflank the enemy, and making flanking meaningless means those lighter units with greater mobility are useless. It means chariots are less impactful. Yes, chariots can do more damage in a charge from the flank, but then they'll get stuck in and die. So yeah, great, you got 1 charge against 1 unit. That's the usefulness of a chariot unit in a battle. So it is a significant disappointment how they decided to handle battles. It feels they didn't improve in any way, shape, or form compared to Troy. And not having battles that are good in any way, shape, or form, and they're a significant detriment, just ruins the game in a lot of ways. One of the most mind-blowing examples that I can think of, like, I was playing a campaign as Ursu, and I was attacking a tier 1 army, at full stack, rented in a settlement, but I had a tier 3 army of really good units that really should have won in a straight up engagement, but they lost. I was like, what the hell is going on? There's severe imbalance issues. Like, it wasn't a question of stats or leadership or having a competent general. No, in every single one of those respects. And you will encounter these situations where just because of the significance of the benefits a defender gets in a minor settlement battle, in particular morale, and it also feels like the AI bonuses are of the nature similar to how things were in Warhammer 2 in melee as well. I think that's the case. Like, significant morale benefits, multiple generals giving more morale. Flanking and morale shocks not really existing in the game. It really ends up ruining the experience. It makes battles horrible. Every settlement battle and siege battle I fought in this game has been a horrible experience. It's not a question of winning. Once you realize what you're dealing with, it stops being an issue. But it ends up being so horrible and tedious that you no longer want to play a campaign after that. Because you know, if you encounter any battle outside of like the very few and rare field battles that you have to fight, with the exception of sea peoples, if you encounter a field battle, like with the exception of that, with the exception of encountering field battle, the very few that you're going to have, the vast majority of settlement battles, siege battles, are just going to be a very painful experience. So here's my conclusion to Total War Pharaoh. The CA Sophia team, when it came to campaign mechanics, probably some of the best campaign mechanics, at least in terms of like basic functionality, not talking about uniqueness, which is severely lacking, but in terms of like growth, happiness, they are some of the best in many years now. The limited resource and the fact that they are trying to force you to have a very slow-paced campaign, that isn't great. But you can clearly see that the people designing the campaign map, the people designing the campaign mechanics, they're trying. I had hope that they would give us more resources, not limit us severely in terms of campaign, but they decided to go down a different path, maybe to mask the fact that there wasn't necessarily all that much to the game if you played a long campaign and 100 turns to wait for a sea people. What ridiculous. How ridiculous. But I'm not going to criticize too much the campaign design team, because they are at least, you can see that they're at least trying to some way. Maybe they make some bad decisions. Maybe they don't make the variety that you'd hope for, but they're at least trying. The battle design team, they don't know what the heck they're doing, quite frankly. Like this nonsense that, lighter units are valuable. They're not. Like, you take any light army against a heavily armored army, or even a mixed army of light and heavy units, put that against a heavy army, unless we're talking about archers, like we're talking infantry specifically here. You take light infantry and heavy infantry against a pure heavy infantry army. And by the way, cost is not necessarily going to be an advantage to the light army, because that's another annoying thing as well. It's not like you're paying less necessarily. You take that, the lighter units are always going to be slaughtered. Is such a bad way. And this is not the first time. This is the third game the CA Sophia has developed that has horrible battles. Every single game that these guys have made, from Thrones of Britannia to Troy to Pharaoh, have had horrible battles. These are, like, while I would not necessarily say these battles are worse than Thrones of Britannia, they are certainly worse than Troy, because at least Troy had the myth units, and mythos especially, but even in the truth behind the myth, they had the myth units to bring battle variety, to give some kind of things that would work. But monster units work because they're different, right? Not because they're a lighter version of an infantry that has far less survivability and just can't stand on their 2 feet in any kind of battle. Ultimately, I don't think the guys designing the battles, either they don't have the resources necessary to bring about the changes that they would need, or they don't know what they're doing. And this idea, this is historically accurate, no. There is nothing related to historical accuracy. You want to talk about Bronze Age warfare? Do you know how many chariots were at the Battle of Kadesh? Thousands of chariots. They dominated the battlefield. The infantry, archers, anything like that, they were meaningless. It came down to who had the best chariots. And interestingly enough, maybe this was what inspired them with lighter units being relevant, but interestingly enough, the Egyptians with their chariots ended up having the superior units, though they almost lost the battle as well, though that was more so because they kind of walked into it, so to speak. They screwed up strategically, but the units they had, the lighter units, played a role. Chariots, like, I don't even want to see chariot on chariot combat in this game. It's awful. The animation work, the way it is. I think the excuse you can find for chariots, they were trying to avoid the situation that they had in Troy when that came out, where chariots are overpowered. I'm going to say it. The chariots should be overpowered in this time period for good reason. I understand the criticism that you had, because they would, like, the problem in Troy wasn't that chariots were broken, it's how they were broken. It was the fact that there was no collision in Troy, and so they would just mop everything in their path, which is not how they're supposed to work. But they should certainly dominate the field battle. They don't. They're useless. Which is pretty shocking. I think Warhammer 3 managed to find a good middle ground as much as it can when it comes to charging units, and the balance between infantry, archers, and all that. And I can't believe I'm praising Warhammer 3 considering all the issues I've had, but I guess this should be a reminder. It can always get worse. And look, I'm coming from the perspective where I dislike a lot of the Warhammer 3 battles. Not because individually they're that terrible, but because there's so many meaningless battles you have to fight in a campaign. I do appreciate that whoever handled the auto-resolves did a much better job this time around, at least with settlements, sieges, and all that. You can avoid fighting a lot of meaningless battles. It is a bit bizarre that chariots always take significant damage in auto-resolve. That's ridiculous. Well, it's actually not that ridiculous. This is the sad part. Chariots will take significant damage, so it's never worth using them. The auto-resolve, funnily enough, this might be the best auto-resolve we've gotten in the Total War game to date. But what happens with chariots is just so sad. How do you make a Bronze Age game where chariots are useful? Well, you can look to CA Sophia to answer that question. The battles are terrible, and that's a major issue. Because if battles are terrible and the campaign is limited, then this is the game not worth playing. Now, I want to make this point very clear before I close up. This is not what I wanted. You might think I'm king negative over here, but believe it or not, as a Total War YouTuber, I absolutely do want Total War to succeed and thrive. I had hoped, genuinely hoped, that the CA Sophia team would take lessons from Troy, give us a better campaign map, which, to be fair, it is, better mechanics, more expansive economy rather than limitations we had, and better battles. They had a recipe of success. That's all you needed to do. Better campaign map, more variety in campaigns, better campaign mechanics, better battle mechanics, better battle balancing. They failed. They couldn't even, genuinely, if Pharaoh is supposed to be an expansion for Troy, they failed even in that perspective. Like, I would sooner play Troy Mythos again than this. At least in terms of the battles. Campaign mechanics, there are some things I do absolutely enjoy in Pharaoh, far more so than in Troy, but you know, I'd rather play a Trojan campaign again in Troy than bother with Pharaoh anymore. And that's a sad state of affairs. It really feels like they learn nothing. And this is the third game where they screw up. Like, how many times can this happen? Like, at this point, I'm just going to ask the question. How many more screw-ups is CAA or Sega? How many more screw-ups are CAA and Sega going to tolerate from these guys? Because Friends of Britannia was a major disaster. Troy, downloaded a lot of copies. Okay, it was literally available for free. Sure, they made money on Troy. Don't ignore that because they got paid by Epic. But Pharaoh might just be the worst launch in Total War history. Take that however way you will. Costine signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.